My name is Carla Abreu and I'm Community and Program Manager at Singularity University, Portugal, working together with Nova Business School of Economics in this initiative. I have the pleasure once more to be your host for today's webinar, an initiative that is part of the Role to Play campaign promoted by Nova SPE that aims to help our community to deal with the several challenges in the current context. Today, we have the presence of Nuno Machado Lopes from Singularity University, Portugal. He is our leadership expert that over the last 2 decades has been working with several companies around the world, helping them to empower humans to become leaders in an uncertain world. Leadership in an exponential world, it's the topic of this session that will help us to understand what the organizational immune system does and why so many digital transformation and innovation processes fail. Before we start, some technical issues. We remind that the Q&A in the presence in the bottom of your screen is available so that you can put your answers that will be answered in that will be answered in the end of this session. The chat is mainly used for technical issues. And now, to learn more about the topic of this session, I'll leave you with Nuno.
Hey there, can you hear me? See me? Okay, great. Can you see my screen as well? Great, okay. So thanks, Carla, and everyone at Nova, and of course, everyone that's joined us today. I'm really excited to be here because I get to share my passion around personal and professional development. This couldn't be a more important time for us all. So I want to kick off really with talking about two of my favorite colleagues. They've already done webinars. And I mention this because one of them, Manel, talks about exponentials, and I'm going to be talking on top of that. And the other one is about talking about VUCA. And Greg brought his experience and talk about the state at which we're at. And so I'm going to build on that, but I kind of focus more on the human side. So I'm really passionate about the human side of the equation, the why. Not just the purpose, but also why do we do what we do? And so we're our worst enemy, we're our worst critic. We prefer the easy way, we always doubt ourselves. We fail to appreciate the small things. We dwell on the past and we kind of fear the future. And so this makes us feel really overwhelmed. And at this stage, especially in the last 2 months, this is where we've been at our most overwhelmed. Exasperated by what Greg talked about in the VUCA world. Now, this VUCA is the sort of what we've seen in the last month or so. It's been the sort of the volatility of the markets, the financial markets, whilst also the uncertainty of whether we're going to be made to close again in the near future, whether the pandemic is going to go away, whether it's not. The complexity of juggling all these new health restrictions, in our businesses, but also at home, with our kids, working, homeschooling. This is all very different for us and very complex. And so, I guess the ambiguity of the knowledge available to us. When you turn your TV on and you start getting all these different informations, it's really hard to be able to cope. So many of us feel overwhelmed, and we're really over our heads developmentally. Now, I prefer this because this shows that there's a mismatch between the complexity in the world and the complexity of our minds. Okay, and we really only have one choice. We either decrease the complexity of the world, and that's not going to happen, is it? Or we increase the complexity of the mind. Now, increasing the complexity of mind it's not handling more information. It's having meaningfully organized information sort of into a larger system, okay? Which basically is learning, it's growing, which in essence is linked directly to our happiness, okay? And this calls really for a different approach to leadership, more adaptive, collective. We can't do it on ourselves. And so this idea of heroism, the one leader, that's not going to cut it. So we keep coming back to this, and there are different versions of this, but in its most simplest form is really that the technology is expanding exponentially, as Manel talked about and showed quite a few examples. But yet we grow in a linear rate. And this is important because, as you can see, the tipping point is where things start to go wrong. Now, the linear thinking has always served us well in the past. Future expectations were based on past performance. It's all about gradual and incremental growth. With exponential technology, and in the world that we've certainly experienced of late, tomorrow is going to be radically different from today. And so we need to increase the complexity of our minds. Now, probably a lot of you have heard the principle of Peter's principle. And Peter's principle is really about how competency, you're promoted to this level of competency, okay? And you're doing really well, and then you get promoted again to another level of competency. And what happens is it gets to a stage where actually you get promoted into incompetency. And this served us well because this was one way of us explaining why we fired people, why there were so many people at C-suite or middle management that were failing. But what if we reframe this and look at this in a different way? What if we looked at this through an adult development framework? And this is Robert Keegan's and Lisa Leahy's work, immunity change, and they're from Harvard. And actually, what they found was that learning for us is we hit plateaus of learning. But as we evolved, and most of us, 75% of adults, are in this reactive, socialized mind. Okay? And this is basically, we're reacting to the world around us. We're dependent on validation from others, and so it's very much a technical and transactional being. And then some of us actually learn and grow and go on this journey of self-development, and we become sort of the creative, self-authoring minds. Okay? And this is very much where the visionary, more strategic, combining relationship focus and task focus. So we're not doing one or the other, we're actually combining these two. And then we have this upper self-development level, that's the integral, which is the self-transforming mind. Okay, and this is where we're transforming. It's where we're tolerant, we're non-judgmental, we're compassionate, and you hear a lot of people saying that we're serving others. Okay, but they really mean it. So intentional servant, which is detached from the ego. And when done right, what does this look like? And someone asked me if I could find maybe not a really obvious example, and I don't think we give enough credit to this company. But if we look again at the sort of the complexity of mind, which we're trying to increase over time to be able to deal with all these problems, maybe we can start with the reactive person, Steve Ballmer, and obviously here we're looking at Microsoft. Now, Steve Ballmer did an incredible job in terms of bringing value to his shareholders. He was very transactional, sales-orientated, not really strategic because he missed out on mobile. But he took Microsoft to a point of where a lot of companies wish they'd been. An income Satya Nadella. Now, very special person, very visionary, strategic. Mixing relationship with task-based, and if you look at the lineup of equipment, whether you're Apple or Windows, it really doesn't matter. But I think most people can look at the lineup of equipment nowadays that Microsoft has and where its software has evolved to, and you even hear people saying, "Wow, this Apple should be doing this." So it's pretty incredible how someone can, in this creative style, bring the company up to the point where Microsoft is. But it's getting rid of other things as well, legacy. And there's one thing he did remove, which is something which is called stack ranking. This comes from Jack Welch's time, which was basically to clean companies. You call the 15% bottom of the employees. Now, ironically, Facebook has introduced this, so we can imagine what's coming next. And this is all very important for culture, okay? And so I don't know Satya, obviously, so I can't say, but maybe he's more integral, and so maybe the people that work with him directly actually see him as serving those around him. Now, there's actually one level below reactive. We don't normally talk about it because it's the egocentric. But here we can actually show it because it's interesting in terms of the Microsoft example, and the way that the company's transformed And this is Bill Gates version 1, not Bill Gates version 2 where he is now. So as far as transformations, this is a great example, but COVID-19 showed us that digital transformation was actually still far from perfect. Actually, that's an understatement for most of us. We realized that actually we were very far from digital transformation in a lot of our companies. And so this was this is from 2020 in Top Risks of 2020. This was in 2019, December. And so it found that 70% of digital transformations don't reach their goals. Now, what that means in effect is that a third of decision makers pursuing digital transformation reported canceling it. And in terms of cost, talking about 900 billion out of 1.3 trillion, this is worldwide, went to waste. Now, if you fast forward after, or in the process, or in the stage and we're at now in March 2020, you could see that a lot of people were now having a different opinion. Leadership was having a different opinion. So they were taking steps to change, and certainly looking at reevaluating the position that they're in. Still, if you know change, but this was across the board. And I actually think that maybe in the future, when they ask this question, who led the digital transformation of your company? I think most people, if they're really honest, they're going to say actually they were forced into it. Now, this all depends if we stop trying to go back to where we were and we actually realize that we need to move forward, not only in terms of transformation digitally, but the most important part probably is actually in the organization. So what gets in the way? Well, what gets in the way is the immune system, okay? And this is the most important function of the corporate, of the organization, because it basically protects the core activities of the organization. So it favors predictable, incremental growth and efficient use of resources. So there's actually two levels. One is to defend the core business and to keep the status quo going. But the other also is because people tend to try and defend themselves as individuals. And that's when they realize that there's more ROI for them than for the organization. Another study of Digital Transformation Insights report of May 2020 of this month actually realized, that culture is everything. So, and that's not a big surprise for us, but it is a surprise when we see what companies are doing in terms of transforming. And you don't want to create a culture for transformation. You want to create a culture where transformation sits nicely as does everything else. Because again, we're in a world that's very different and that will change, and tomorrow will be very different. And so basically 80% of respondents said that the biggest challenge around DTX by a long distance is adapting culture quickly to new ways of working. Okay? And think about that, adapting culture, because it's not something we should be doing. We should have it in place. So the other thing is technical and adaptive challenges, that gets in the way. Now technical challenges come up and they're meant to be resolved by technical software. Okay? But the problem is when most of the challenges we have nowadays are actually adaptive in this VUCA world. And so if we throw technology at it, it's not going to work, and it'll probably be worse. Okay, so we don't resolve adaptive problems with technology. We do resolve it with effective leadership, collective leadership, and having a very different leadership that has relationship-based but also task-based. Okay, and it's really more to do with self-development and the continuous evolving of self-development than just doing quick fixes. And if you look at how companies were forced into total remote work, the problem wasn't technical issues. You resolve those quickly, unless the internet goes down, which it didn't, which was great. And I think most of us were surprised. Where the issues came up were adaptive. It's people turning up as they are, as themselves, shocking others when really shouldn't. We started to find out great things about people. And this last thing is, again, something that's promoted, or if it's not promoted, it's something that occurs in organizations, is that everyone really is doing a second job of hiding their weaknesses, uncertainties, and limitations, managing others' favorable impressions. And really, you want to promote where the only mistake that you don't allow people to make is to hide their mistakes or weaknesses. Okay, and so imagine if you could redirect that energy into the purpose of the company, create a culture of practice. In contrast, where everyone is learning and growing all the time. Again, this is where studies show this is where real happiness comes from. So, in a way, to get this all now into one or two slides, really to think about what exponential leadership is, it's really this change of mindset, or if you want a reframing from incremental to exponential. Okay, and people talk about thinking normal, thinking big, but what you need to do is you need to think big, okay, and not worry about how you're getting there, and that's where most people get into trouble. You really want to think big, and then you want to retrocast, and then you find the past, okay, the path. Sorry. And then you know, there's seeing the route and there's envisioning the route. Now remember, you have this exponential growth that goes up. Well, funnily enough as well, when you look down, you're not looking down the tunnel because you won't see the light. It goes around, okay? And so you have to have these strong principles so that you're not micromanaging people. Okay. And again, there isn't one leader, there isn't one CEO, there's collective leadership because the complexity of our minds cannot cope with the complexity of the world. What can cope is us working together and working in a different way. And I think also it's interesting, I'd never really looked at science fiction in my past, but you get so much from science fiction than trying to look at the reality, because it stretches our horizon. And I've had some incredible experiences of late. I'm talking to people that have lived very much in the science fiction, so that's interesting. And so the question we can ask when we are back in our organizations, or whether we're still remote or not, is: have we, from the ground up, designed our organization so that it supports growth of its members? Because better me plus better you equals better us. And it brings us to really the sort of this last idea of what exponential leadership is, and building on top of everything that we discussed up to here, which is basically getting feedback. So having streams of feedback from people that you work with, but having a culture, a safe culture, where people can also communicate with you and tell you what they're thinking. There is recruitment fit, with culture. We've talked about this, but do you have your MTP, or your massive transformative purpose, which is more than a vision and a mission? And is it true? How do we know it? This is a question that a lot of times we ask. It's not that if it's true in essence, but how do you know? Why don't you entertain other possibilities? Not focusing on the problem, but what led to it. And like before, it's really important controlling principles and not people. And so in companies that have strong principles, they don't need to control their collaborators. Which brings you to authentic community, learning. And I can't stress this enough, which is learning should be a continuous process. It shouldn't be something that is only available to certain people in the organization. It should be for everyone and continuous, because that gives collective intelligence. And we can't forget that where there's collective intelligence, there's also collective stupidity. And so to finish off, I want to be the very best version of myself. I want to work where I can show up as myself, where I don't need to hide or worry about what others think. And as a leader, I'll leave you with this. I was once told by my coach these three things, and they stayed with me, which is: be the shepherd, don't eat the grass, hold the space. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nuno, for your presentation. Let me just share here just 2 or 3 questions, if you have time.
Yep.
One question, for example: from your experience and taking in consideration the past 2 months, do you think that leaders have given the right answer to this crisis?
I think it's early, really. I think, like in all cases, do you mean leaders of organizations? Do you mean leaders of countries? I think leaders of countries we can leave out. We're going to get into politics, and I think everyone has an idea there. Organizations, I think very much like politics. I think we haven't had time to see. I think if you ask people that work in organizations, I think if the change has been chaotic, let's just say that if you're going from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, which I know a lot of people are, then no, they're not doing it right. Okay, and so I think that's probably the first validator is, if you're one of those people that are doing, 1 hour Zooms, 2 hours Zooms, 3 hours Zooms, or 10 Zooms in a day, then your organization is definitely not doing it right. Because what we're doing is we're trying to hang on to the past and like ride this through as if this is something that it's not here to stay. It's also, we're not giving it an opportunity to change a lot of what's wrong or what was wrong pre-COVID. So I think also we should use this time, and I think a lot of us have, during these 2 months, have reflected a lot. And I think we should also look forward and not back.
We have another question here. Do you believe there is now an opportunity to change the culture of an organization?
Yeah, I mean, the culture is, there are lots of definitions of what culture is. At the end of the day, it's what happens when you're not there. It's what happens, it's what people do. But at the end of the day, it's to define the culture, you need to have these principles, what's important for you. And you need it to everybody be on board. So if you ask everybody in your organization, why are we doing this? Why are we here? And if people look at you blankly, then, you don't have a culture, or the culture that you have is one that is just, it's a reflex of that moment. And so, of course, this is an opportunity to change the culture of the organization. This is an opportunity to get everyone involved. This is an incredible opportunity to stop making people put their kids away in Zoom meetings, and just to find out, and to look and look in their houses and look at them and see the human side of people. And so I think this is a great opportunity. And yesterday I was researching about, Zoom fails, and I was just laughing at, so many things that have happened, but it's been great because it's connected people. At the end of the day, I've heard a lot of people also say, oh my God, our leaders dress really badly. But it's great. It's great to see them at home. It's great to see that they're like us in a way. Yeah. Except the ones in their private jets and their whatever. Maybe that's not a good idea.
But about culture, we will invite everyone to be with us next Wednesday, because we will have another speaker from SU Portugal talking about culture, which is going to be also very interesting. We have time for one more question, Nuno. Is the sense of urgency more powerful than a vision? In your experience, what has been a greater motivator?
So the question of sense of urgency versus vision. Okay, so don't really separate those two. A sense of urgency, I think, is important because it kicks you up the backside, there were loads of things I wanted to do that I'd been not procrastinating. Maybe it was procrastinating. It wasn't happening. And then suddenly there was an urgency because there was this time, I have 1 or 2 months that I'm going to be in lockdown. I really don't want to be that person that gets to the end of the 2 months and looks back and sort of, watch TV all the way through Netflix or whatever. And so, yeah, there is a sense of urgency, but I think the most important is vision, because as you get older, you realize that things take time. And you have to be okay with that, and I think that's the hardest thing. So sense of urgency a lot of times can be bad for you because it can cause you stress, when in reality, what is it? We underestimate how much we do in the short term, overestimate how much we do in the short term, and underestimate how much we do in the long term. And so I think really, if I had to choose between one of these two, definitely vision.
Okay, we can have one more question. From Margarida Bajanca. I think that for exponential leadership, everyone in organization can and should be a leader. That implies a lot of training and coaching. What are your views on this?
Okay, it depends really how you define leader. I think everyone has a voice. Everyone has a say. There are people that don't want to lead. And it's not because they're not good at it, they just don't want to do it. What you find in scrums and smaller teams is, sort of leaders that emerge at the moment. I think you need in organizations, you still need structure, and especially large organizations, you still need structure. And you're talking about a transformation a lot of times from legacy to a new, I wouldn't even say a new, because you don't want to transform organizations at the core. You don't want to disrupt. You want to innovate. If you're going to disrupt anything, you want to go to the edge and maybe even create another company or something else. But so the transformation within and with leaders, I think. Now, I don't think everyone should be a leader. I think the idea of collective leadership is where actually you're a leader, but you're a very special leader because you're relationship-based, you're task-based, and you bring everyone in. There's a company called Bridgewater, and there's a great TED Talk. And he gives the example of how everybody rates each other consistently and constantly. And he shows an example of an email of someone that was in a meeting. I think it was an intern that'd been there maybe a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, and he was sent an email to him giving him a D- that he basically hadn't made the effort. And this is the CEO. This is an investment fund, probably the biggest investment fund or the most successful investment fund. And so I think if you're at that level of transparency, that level of humanity, if you're at the integral level, if you can, and that's, I think the focus here is shouldn't be on exponential leadership. The focus should be on developing everybody, and obviously you as a leader. Exponential leadership also has this other aspect of exponential thinking, which is a different mindset also from maybe the other development side that we discussed throughout.
I don't resist to do you one more question, because I think it's very interesting facing the context that we have now, is how leaders encourage autonomy while keeping people on their track and motivated, because this is something that we are really feeling, and presently now everyone is at home working. How do we encourage autonomy?
Okay, so for all those leaders that are thinking or asking, how can we encourage autonomy? They're thinking of the consequences. If I encourage autonomy, then fill in the blank. I would encourage all of them to go to the leadership circle. It's free, and to do an assessment. And you can ping me afterwards if you want any help with that, or there are other people that work with but it's free. Now, what most people will find, leaders find, is that actually there's this part in the micromanagement where they're really high on, okay? And we see this so much with leaders. And so whenever you ask this question about autonomy, because it's always something else that's behind it, which is, if I give people autonomy, who's going to run the ship? And they're not going to work. And so it really has to do with also, there's always the polarity, there's always the other side of it as well, where you're putting the energy. Now, we shouldn't be fooled. I remember very quickly this example. I was going to Las Vegas every year for conferences, and I met Tony Hsieh very early on, and then he kept inviting me over to Zappos. And I remember that when they went into the sort of self-management phase, they really lost the plot there. And maybe they overestimated their culture. And I had actually started talking to some people there, after they'd sort of sold me on the idea that holacracy was going really well. And they were telling me about how the very next day, half the people didn't turn up, because as it turns out, if you give people the choice not to go and work the next day, quite a few of them choose not to go. And then they had a problem because they had no managers to go and tell them to work. But I think I would always look at what's behind that question, because I don't think normally you hear people on the other side saying, why don't we have more autonomy? I think a lot of times it's more of, or at least they don't have the courage to ask, why do you micromanage me? Why are you always ringing me? Why do we always have to have these meetings? Let's create this culture. Let's have these principles. I know exactly what you want. Now let me go do it, and it's not going to be the same as if you would do it. And I think that's trust. That's people really understanding that collectively we're going to be much better than individually.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nuno, for all this information. I think we could be here hours answering questions about this issue because it's very, very important. Thank you so much for your collaboration.
Thank you.
Once more, we would like to remind that this initiative is part of the Role to Play campaign promoted by NovSPE and available at role2play.novspe.pt, where you can find all the webinars that have already happened. We invite you once more to be here tomorrow for another webinar. Tomorrow we will have Luís Veiga Martins and also Filipa Saldanha that will be talking about the road to a sustainable recovery, which is also a very important issue for us. Thank you very much. See you all tomorrow.